Great. So let's get started. I think 33 people in the class is great. Yeah, so I have posted the assessment online, and it should be on my website. You should have no problem accessing it. You'll notice that it's a little bit more of a conceptual assessment this time, so it's much more about learning about how to tell visual narratives and the ways in which different kind of visual variables will affect the story that you're telling. This is more than just kind of like, see, I can make the trend look really small or really big kind of thing. It's more about learning a little bit about how to express yourself in a graphical style in ggplot. So I'm not going to be talking too much about the various kinds of theming, and insofar as I'll be talking about color, I'll be talking about color as far as like using responsible scales for your visualizations. But what I think is the most useful is to show you a couple of different things that you may not have seen before in the visualization space. So what I plan on doing today is walking you through a couple of different comparisons and showing you different ways or different geometries or you know, methods of showing those things that may be helpful. So does anybody have any questions at this point about what we're doing in this chunk or what we're doing after it? There's a question for the first part of the assessment. When are we meant to answer which is the most effective? Is there a definite right or wrong answer to this? I don't understand what you mean by when. You're supposed to do it in the response to the question. And in some cases, there is a definite wrong answer. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but generally speaking, no, there's not like a definite right answer. A lot of things about visualization are subjective. So what I want you to be able to do is be able to justify like what your judgments about visualizations are based in. So for things like cartographic questions, there are sometimes right and wrong answers. For instance, if I have a diverging color map that goes from one color through some neutral color into another color, I need to make sure that the ends of those are mapped in a useful way. So a common cartographic issue is that people use diverging color maps to model phenomena that aren't diverging, where the center has no real useful value. Or also, you know, situations where you do have a diverging phenomenon that's mapped in a color map that isn't diverging. So I'll talk a little bit about that, hopefully today. If not, I'll try and get to it tomorrow. So first off, so this assessment just uses 3 data sets that we've used before. It'll be the week of data that you're aware of. You've seen it, you love it, this data, and that'll be primarily used for mapping, because we'll be talking about choropleths mainly. The earnings data, which you've seen again, and you should be familiar with. And then the temperature data, which I've tidied prematurely, and I've also converted it into an ordinal variable for the months so that you have the right kind of structure for that. So we'll be primarily making comparisons based on these 3 kinds of data sets. And the first thing that I really want to talk about is the plotting of relationships. So most of the plots that we've made before in this class fall down in 2 kinds. There's plots of relationships and plots of distributions. And understanding a relationship is understanding the joint distribution of 2 variables. So, as I increase in my height, I increase in my earnings. That's a relationship. The important thing to remember about relationships is that they are, in a sense, a measurement of the joint density of two sets of observations, or two kinds of observations. So what I'd like to show you today is how understanding the relationship and understanding the joint density might be a little different. And I'll show you some new kind of geometries and things that will allow you to think about this in a better way. So you have seen many, many times plots like this, where you have a variate, here height and earnings, and some kind of line of best fit plotted through them, right? Now, there are a couple of issues with this plot that I'd like to start off talking about. The first issue is that you can see there's something called, the technical term is clumping, which is kind of funny, where you have values on the x-axis that are all kind of clustering together. So you can tell that this survey only recorded height to a single decimal place, or 2 decimal places, right? So you can see that they weren't recording fractional centimeters, because when I go from 1.6 meters to 1.8 meters, I have to go in steps of a particular, what is that? So 1.6, 1.61, 1.62, 1.63, 1.64. Maybe it looks like it's recorded every 2 centimeters or something. So it might be originally recorded in inches. That's important because you get this kind of gridding effect where you can only really visualize the distribution of x at discrete values. There's nothing between 1.6 and then the very next value at 1.6 whatever. Okay? So this kind of thing in a plot causes a little bit of problems because you can't necessarily understand exactly how dense or how kind of distributed the plot is at 1.6. So there's this issue where you get a bunch of points that are all stacked on top of one another when you're plotting relationships. It's called overplotting. When values overplot, it means that you get a bunch of geometries that occupy the same space. And so continuing to plot observations on top one another doesn't give you any additional information. So that we call this sometimes overplotting. Noah asks, is this height variable still considered to be a continuous variable? Well, we could think about it as a continuous variable. It's continuous in inches, but all continuous measurements have a kind of sufficiently fine-grained resolution below which they can't go. So if I record, say, earnings, it's unlikely that it's going to be responding to their earnings variable smaller than a single cent. So everything that is continuous is at some scales of measurements discrete. And that's an important thing to realize because it results in these kinds of clumping issues and overplotting. So what I'd like to show you are a couple different ways that overplotting can be addressed. The first thing that's very simple is the strategic use of transparency. So just taking the same plotting code that we've done to make the geom smooth, so we've just got the geom point and the geom smooth to plot our line, we can make points a little bit transparent. The graphical parameter that governs the transparency of a geometry is usually called alpha. And that comes from the terminology where you're in the red, green, blue RGB color space where you have alpha being the measure of transparency. And it's just the term that they've used for that in that color space. In other color spaces, there's a different language, but kind of whenever you talk about adjusting alpha in visualizations, you're talking about transparency. So if I add an alpha argument to my geom point, I'm going to make every point that I plot transparent to some degree. And alpha is a value that varies between 0, which means totally transparent, and 1, which means not at all transparent or fully opaque. So if I'm concerned about overplotting and the fact that I can't tell sort of how many points are at one particular place, I might make some of them transparent. If I make this the plot instead, it looks like this. So we go from this plot where it looks like all of the areas of points are approximate, if I see a black dot, it looks just as, dense there as it does anywhere else, to a plot where you can obviously see that some areas are way less dense than others. So using transparency is one helpful way to avoid overplotting. Okay? Now, the use of transparency routinely is a good thing to keep in mind. You want to be thinking a lot about the ways in which the elements in your plot are interacting, and you want to be really careful about presenting a plot that has a significant amount of overplotting. Because when you have overplotting, it's indicating that something is being obscured. The other thing that can be useful when talking about overplotting and in particular points is using something called jittering. So jittering is the use of little bits of noise to change the position of a given geometry. So instead of something that looks like this, where I have all of these kinds of gridded points, I might jitter my points a little bit to try and give them artificial sort of movements in the x direction to make it look a little bit smoother. Now we still have a sizable amount of overplotting here, so I might want to add alpha as 0.1 to my jitter. And then we get something that looks like this. You can still tell that there's a little bit of binning here in the sense that you can see that there are distinctive values of height that are recorded, but now it looks more continuous. Okay? So this kind of thing is generally referred to as methods to address overplotting. The other thing that you can do that isn't really a method to address overplotting directly is the use of a marginal density. So the last thing I want to show you in this sense is something from a package called ggextra, which contains a bunch of additional kind of fun tools. And ggmarginal gives you distributions on the edges of your scatter plots. So what this helps you see is that the density of points is extremely strong, around 1.6 to about 1.65, and tails off as you go down. Or sorry, tails off as you go up, as you get higher and higher heights. Even though we have the overplotting in the original visualization, The density on the marginal allows you to see better where you have a ton of points and where you don't have a ton of points. I should clarify, by marginal, I mean the fact that we've now got these kinds of density curves on the top and on the side. Does everybody see the density curves I'm referring to that have now been plotted above and to the right of our scatter plot? That's kind of like if we made a geom density for just height, or the geom density for just earnings. Okay? So that's the GG marginal function in GG extra. Now I think there's, type is equal to histogram. I can make it a histogram as well, rather than a density. And there you can see for sure that, the height of the bins corresponds to the number of points in that bin. So if I were to just show you the scatter plot and ignore those densities, visually speaking, it's not immediately apparent that there's a ton of observations really close to zero. That's because of overplotting. Even though I'm using some alpha on the geometries and I'm trying to make them transparent, I still am not able to identify that the bin around zero is extremely highly populated. By adding on marginal histograms or marginal densities, I can see that. Does everybody see what I'm talking here with the issues of overplotting and ways that we can address them? You've got transparency, you've got jittering, and you've got marginal densities. Finn asks, would you want to mention that you've done jittering, as the values have changed a little? Yes, you would. You'd want to say jittered for clarity. It's pretty common to see plots that have a little bit of jittering in them. But the way that you do that is using geom jitter, and you can control the amount that's jittered. You can do it yourself. I find it to be a very useful technique, especially for plotting things based on points that are not actually continuous. The last thing that I want to show you is if I'm really only interested in the line, and I'm not really interested in necessarily seeing all of the points, last kind of useful geometry you might want to know about is something called a rug. So if I just had the, whoops, I deleted my plus. So if I just had the line, right? And I wanted some indication where my observations are, but I had either too many observations to really focus on, or I didn't really want to deal with all of that, I could use a geom rug. And in statistical visualization, a rug is an indicator of a point that's put on the x-axis. So implicitly speaking, what this is telling me is that all of the points that I have are located at the sort of lines on the x-axis, and they intersect one of the lines on the y-axis. So a rug is like a vertical line that you put on the axis denoting the position of a point. So if I had that alongside of a geom point, it would look like this, and that's pretty busy. So generally speaking, we only use either a rug or a point, and we don't use both. If what I wanted to focus on was the line, using a rug makes it a little bit clearer while still giving me an indication of where my points are. Does everybody see that? A rug is this kind of sort of lines that are put directly on the axis to indicate where a point is. So this indicates that there's a point somewhere along that y level. We don't know which x value it's paired to, but we do know that it's sort of paired to some of them. And I believe if you jitter before you use the rug, yeah, the rug ignores it. Okay? So this is kind of methods to deal with overplotting and things like that. Now, if what you're concerned about is showing the relationship between two entities, and you actually are not necessarily concerned about the position of points, you can always just leave the points behind. So going back to our histogram with the marginals, right? So I've got this line, and I've got these marginal histograms. Well, if I was interested in showing you the density of points together, and also have that line, I could just partition my area into little cells and show you a really bright value if I had a lot of points there, or a really dark value if I had fewer points there. It would be like taking these bins on the edge of my marginal plot and using them intersected to show where my points are. In ggplot, that is bin 2D. Bin 2D is like a two-dimensional histogram. It allows you to move from a plot like this with the marginal histograms to a plot like this, which has a histogram in 2 dimensions. This immediately makes it obvious that we have a ton of values down at the bottom here, which are not very clear from that. So by leaving points behind altogether and instead focusing on a two-dimensional histogram, you can get a better idea of the distribution of points in addition to how the line is being fit. In addition to bin 2D, I prefer using hex. Okay, so the hex, instead of using squares, uses hexagons. Surprise, surprise. But they're functionally the same visualization. Sometimes, you get these weird little graphical artifacts, and you can adjust the number of bins to kind of give you better looking plots. But the two-dimensional histogram is a very useful tool. The other thing that you can do, instead of using a histogram in 2 dimensions, you can actually make a kind of kernel density in 2 dimensions. So you remember when we were using our marginal, but we had this smooth curve, right? We're not using bins anymore. We're actually using smooth curves to show where points are. Well, the geom density 2D constructs in ggplot are like these single-dimensional curves, but in 2 dimensions. So using geom density 2D, I can show you something like this. So this is a 2-dimensional kernel density. And immediately it becomes obvious that there are parts of my point cloud that are really dense that I can't see, necessarily speaking, from the marginal here. I don't know where in this point cloud those peaks of density occur. Georgia asks, what would that be useful for? Well, it's useful anytime you're interested in showing the density of a point cloud in 2D. It's useful when you want to show the distribution jointly of 2 things. So anytime I want to talk about the distribution of 2 observations together, and I have issues like I'm talking about with the overplotting. Remember, all of these are in comparison to something like this, where all I'm showing you is that there's positions of height and positions of earnings. If I show you an alpha, I'm still kind of focusing on the line, but I'm giving you some transparency so that you can see where things are sort of stronger, or where there's more points or fewer points. If I use jitter, that effect is magnified. If I use a marginal density, I can see individually where there are many height observations or many earnings observations. If I use a two-dimensional histogram, then I can tell immediately that in some cells there's going to be way more points. That's still kind of an abstraction. And then with the contour, I can tell immediately where it's really dense in that two-dimensional space and where it's not. So if I have overplotting problems, these are a couple of different strategies to get beyond them. Sophia asks, can you describe how to interpret the point cloud, please? Yeah, sure. So this is the relationship between height and earnings. And what I'm talking about is the issue that I can't tell how many points are in this kind of black strip at each height, because those points are what we say overplotting. If I plot 20 points all on top of one another, I can't actually tell how many observations are at one location. So that's how to interpret the point cloud. And we've been dealing with the same point cloud for this whole illustration. You made this plot last lab, or last assignment, or something like it. Okay? The last plot, you mean, so the contour plot, this one. Okay, so the contour plot is kind of like, if you've ever seen like a topological plot or a topological map where bright colors are higher than dark colors, or they give you an indication of how high a surface is. So what this is trying to show you is that, let's say the dark color, the dark purple, indicates that there are very few observations in this area. The yellow indicates there are the most observations in that area. So what that's telling us is that the density of this point set here is really high at low earnings and a height of sort of 1.64. So because of the overplotting, we can't see that. Remember, we can't see that in this. We don't know that it's densest right in that area. But if I show you something like a kernel density, I know immediately that there's way more observations in this low income height between 1.6 and 1.65. And I can use that. In addition, this plot would never give you an indication that this is a very dense area here. The kernel density does. So just because you can make a plot of x versus y doesn't mean that's telling you all the information. The main point here is that there's issues with overplotting. Histograms on the side is this gg extra gg marginal command. Okay? How can you statistically back up what the density plot shows, RE clustering? Well, it is a statistical operation, estimating the technicality, like the mathematical term is called intensity. So what this is showing you is the intensity of the point pattern at any particular location. And it's actually a statistical process. It's something called a kernel density estimate. It's taking a kind of smooth function that models distance decay and fitting it at every point that you see. And then it's saying, okay, in the yellow area, that kernel density estimate is the highest because there's way, way, way many points close to a particular location. So what you can say is, whenever we're talking about the location of a point in both x and y, we're talking about the joint density. So statistically, that's what we're saying. The joint density is really high. So there's a lot of people with really low earnings, regardless of their height, but they're mainly kind of down between 1.6 meters and 1.5 meters, or 1.6 meters and 1.65 meters. They're all down there. There's also a cluster of people that earn quite a bit more at 1.6 something, 1.62. And that's the joint density. So it's just a couple of ways to show you how to deal with overplotting. Okay, the next bit is stuff that I wanted to show you about different ways to plot like densities. So, yes, okay. So I need to copy from the assignment. Hold on. Where's the week along? There we go, yeah. So let's see, which one is this one? Yeah, okay. So the other kind of comparison that we've been talking about a lot is we've used box plots before to show how the distribution of something changes over time. So what this is attempting to do, and what a box plot is actually summarizing, again, is the fact that we have a bunch of geom points that are all sitting at the same location. So I've got some distribution of points at discrete values of years that I'm trying to summarize. Okay? And this time I'm less interested in kind of the linear relationship between the two, and instead I just want a kind of sense of the distribution in each year. So one thing that's useful might be, instead of thinking about it as separate box plots, which get really hard to kind of interpret, because you get each box plot right next to one another, there's like a gap in between. There's a geometry in ggplot that's called the ribbon, which just colors between two lines. So using the ribbon, I can take the top edge of where the box plot is, which is the 75th percentile of my data in each year, and where the bottom is, which is the 25th percentile in each year, and I can draw a ribbon between them. So just looking at what that might look like, it would be something like this. The ribbon is the shaded gray area that is surrounding the red line. So that's called a geom ribbon. If you ever want to color in the area between 2 points or between 2 lines, in ggplot terms, that's a ribbon. Okay, so geom ribbon, and it needs an x or a y min and a y max plus an x to color in between 2 lines vertically. And I think it can also take x min, x max, and y. If I flip it, I think it'll work as well. Yeah, so you can color in both vertically and horizontally, depending on if you say, okay, color, my x min is this variable, my x max is this other variable, color in the space between them. Or if I say my X and then I give it a Y min and a Y max, it'll color it in that way. So ribbon is the thing that you use to color in between a range. And you can use ribbon plus statistics that you're interested in to give you an indicator of the density of your pattern. Okay? Just showing you how another kind of two-dimensional histogram might work would be something like in 1.5b in the assignment. So in this case, it gives me an indication of where the points are over time, like a histogram or like a box plot would, but does so in a way that's kind of less visually busy. Can you use ribbon for showing the standard deviation of a time series? Yeah, you can. You can totally do that. So if you get a standard error on that time series, you can use ribbon to do plus or minus the line that you plot. Yep. So anytime you want to show what I would call like an envelope or a kind of uncertainty bound around that, you can use a ribbon to do it in a smooth fashion. You can also use geom error bar if you want to do it for discrete points. So if you want to do it for a point plus or minus an area, you'd use error bar, not ribbon. Ribbon is for continuous measurements. But both of them kind of serve a similar function. Great question. So this is just to show you that there's another kind of two-dimensional histogram thing you could use. I love geom hex. It's like my favorite kind of thing. But you could also use bin 2D and see something like that. But it's not hexagonal, so it's ugly. That's better. I mean, obviously, you know that I'm joking here. It's a subjective measurement. I'm not going to penalize you if you do that. So, and then the other thing, you know, is that boxplot supports a bunch of different options. So if you find this to be distracting, you can change the outlier size to be way smaller. Or you can say outlier alpha is equal to 0.01 and make them nearly transparent. So check the options that are available to you sometimes. If what you're interested in is just to kind of make the plot and remove the busier elements that you don't care about, you want to either change the what are called visual variables, things like the transparency, things like the marker size, things like the color. You want to reduce the amount of ink you spend on things you don't care about. So if all you want is to show the main center of the distribution in every year, you want to kind of hide all the other detail about the data that you don't care about. So even in a box plot, you can hide all the outliers and just focus in on the central part of the data. And that's useful as well. You want to make sure there's this principle in the reading you might see mentioned of what they call proportional ink. Basically, your eye is going to be drawn to the things that are that have the most ink expended on them, the things that are darkest, the things that are sort of most detailed. So you want to kind of use transparency and marker size and things like that to hide the things you don't focus on and emphasize the things you do. Patrick asks, could you use ribbon for showing confidence intervals on a regression? It might be better in that case to use the error bar, because each estimate from a regression is kind of its own thing, and it's not a continuous kind of continuously changing thing over a variable. So you could, it would just connect those uncertainty estimates between different betas. So you might prefer to use geom error bar, which just does that by itself. So let's see if I can show you a geom error bar. Probably not. Yeah, Ymin and Ymax. Yeah, so I would need to do geom ribbon, something like that, geom error bar. So that's what a I'll turn off the alpha and the coloring because that makes it impossible to see. So error bar looks like that. So ribbon connects each geometry, whereas error bar just shows you the bounds for that. So this is like an even sort of further reduced presentation of a box and whisker plot, because each of these things is sort of its own geometry, and I have no indication of the mean. I have no indication of the 95th percentile. It's just the interquartile range that I've computed before I went to plot. So if you wanted to plot a regression coefficient, you could use the error bar to say, okay, I have, you know, the value inside the error bar. Here that would be like, sorry, x equals 0, y equals p50. So that might look like that for a regression coefficient. Isabel asks, what are the y min and y max values? What is the p25 and p75? In this example, I've just computed the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile manually before I went to go plot. And I did that because I just wanted to show you different visualizations that you can make if you have these bounds. So it's not super important that you understand what those things are, but like, let's say I had a maximum temperature and a minimum temperature in a year. I might need to compute the that range and then show that range. So it's just a way of showing a quantile for a given distribution. So in each year I have a bunch of prices, and I'm just computing the 25th percentile price, which is like the most expensive cheap property, the 50% price, which is like the median property price, and then the 75th percentile price, which is like the cheapest expensive property. So it's just a way of giving you a distribution of kind of what the prices are. And it's exactly the same as the edges of a box plot, which it seems like it's not gonna like that right now. So it's like, it's just a part of the kinds of, sorry, x equals year, y equals price, group equals year, plus geom box plot. It's just the same thing we're seeing here, but I'm ignoring all of these outliers. So I'm just showing you the central range that the boxes take. Okay, so it's like I've computed those statistics myself because the box plot's going to compute more than I want. So it's just a way to show you that you can plot these distributions in different ways, and I'm trying to give you some names for how these things look. Okay, so ribbon is the connected space between an x min and an x max, or a y min and a y max. It's like a filled polygon that stretches over the space. The error bar is like that, but gives you discrete points for every x value that you plot. And then you've also got these kinds of 2D histograms, which you can use for great effect. Okay? So the last thing that I want to talk about is when you're talking about comparing distributions. So if I wanted to talk a little bit about the earnings for every race in the earnings data, I might generate a plot that looks like this. So I'm generating a bunch of histograms that give me each of the races on in a single column. So each row is one race. This chunk of code is in line 80. It's not in the assignment. It's in this lecture notes that I've just talking about today. I'll post it if you want. But it's just a histogram, geom histogram, plus a facet grid. So we talked about facet grid the other day. Without the facet grid, if I just said make a histogram and group it by race, that's what we would get. And that's pretty unclear, right? because I'm over plotting again. I'm showing you histogram plotting on top of one another, and there's no easy way to make a comparison. So if I do a facet and I say race in one column, I get something that looks like this by default. That isn't like what I showed you the first time. So facet grids automatically make sure that your x-axes and your y-axes are the same. So you see how in each of the facets, yeah, the dot is the same as the 1. So dot just means put everything on the left in one column or everything on the right in another column. Dot just means I'm just talking about a one-dimensional thing. So by default, facet grids are going to make sure that every facet is on the same scale. So your y-axis is going to vary from 0 to 600 for every single facet. And that means that we can see the row describing the white population really well, but we don't see the rows describing anything else very well. So one thing that's important to remember when dealing with facets is what's the variable that I want to compare? And then I might have to adjust the things that I don't necessarily need to compare about. So here, I want to see the distributions of earnings, and I want to compare them between the races. So I want to make sure my x-axis remains the same for all my facets. But I need some variation in the y-scale so that I can sort of see the bins in the Asian category, in the native category, in the other category, in the black category. So the facet grid and facet wrap functions have this scales argument. By default, it's fixed, meaning that everybody has the same scale. The options that it lets you have are free x, which makes it so that everybody gets their own x scale, free y, which makes it so that everybody has their own y scale, and free, where every facet has its own scale. Generally speaking, you shouldn't use the free unless you're just trying to give a very general impression about the different kinds of relationships in your data. Because if you set all of your facets to have free scale, it's really hard to compare them. So you should always attempt to arrange your facets on the common axis. So you see how here I have made my x the shared scale. The code says free y, so I'm keeping x the same. And then I'm allowing the y's to vary. So when you use facets, you link the coordinate systems between each facet. And you need to choose smart links that make the comparisons effective. The 1 is the same as the dot. There's no, it doesn't, if I use 1, it does the same thing. It gives me a 1 at the top. If I use dot, it doesn't give me a title for the column. It's the same arrangement. It doesn't matter. It's just a different way of indicating that I just want one of whatever's going there. So if I use a dot, it's going to think of it as a 1 and just give you that column. Likewise, if I turned it the other way and said dot tilde race, that would be one row. The thing on the left of the tilde is the column split, and the thing on the right of the tilde is the rows. Or I guess it indicates the variable that's split over columns, and the thing on the right indicates the thing that's split over rows. So if I did something like education by race, then each facet contains a unique combination of the values that are there. Okay, so that's facet grid. But my point wasn't to walk you through that, because I think it's important for you to kind of learn that yourself through playing with examples that are in my code and then also in the workbook that I've linked. And read the documentation, because that's the point of documentation. My main point was just to show you that when you have the scales, when you're doing a faceting, you need to make sure that you can compare between the facets. So you want to keep whatever you're comparing over constant, so that you can read each facet at a glance. So here I've kept the x-axes the same because they're aligned up and down. So every facet has the same x-axis. But there are more white people in the sample than there are native people in the sample. So if I keep the y scale the same, I'm not going to be able to see any other group than white. So I need to allow the y scale to change in each facet to be able to compare. It's just about making sure that you're aware of those kinds of scale arguments. This is not the only way to think about this or to examine this kind of plot, is the faceting. So even though the histogram looks bad when we plot over it, if I use geom density and some alpha, I can kind of get a sense of the distribution of populations together as well. So this is going to overplot the densities together, and sometimes it's useful to see where they overlap. So this is using the geom density. This is sometimes a way that people show distributions together rather than by faceting, because it converts the proportions in each class versus their earnings to a percentage. So you can say, 1% or something about has the earnings of exactly 50. And it gives you the sort of statistical density of the other class in that range. Okay? So geom density can be used to do that. Geom box plot, of course, you've seen these before. Which code created that plot? It's just the geom density call. So I've put a fill equal. I'll post the code after the lecture, but the point is the geom density construct is that kind of distribution. Geom density is showing the same thing as geom histogram, but it's doing it in a way where this is now the sort of statistical density, the percentage of cases, rather than the count. It's just a kind of like a continuous histogram. You use it to do the same things as a histogram, and sometimes it's easier to interpret because you don't have any bins, you just have lines. So density and histogram are like two different ways to show the same thing. They both show you a distribution. Just like we were talking about before, when we had the kind of marginal things, I could use a B or a histogram, and either way it would do the same thing. Or I could show you a two-dimensional histogram, or I could show you a two-dimensional density, and it does the same thing. So they're just one-to-one mappings of one another. A density is continuous, a histogram is built on bins, same thing. The other thing I'd like to show you, so you've got this geom box plot, right? And its center line is the median value for that group. The end of the box indicates the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. And the tips of the line represent the first percentile and the 99th percentile, or 95th, depending on the default of the graphics program. So 50% of the observations fall within the box, and 95% or 99% of the observations, depending on the defaults, fall on the line. So that's what box plots show. 50% of the white people in this sample earn somewhere between what looks like about 30,000 a month or 30,000 a year and 70,000 a year. So 50% of the white people have that. For Asians, you know, they have a sort of similar median and a similar middle 50%. But showing the data in this way ignores information about the continuous sort of density of those things in the middle of the distribution. So there's another kind of plot called a violin plot that looks like this. And a violin plot, so named because sometimes it kind of looks like a violin, shows you its width indicates the amount of data in that area. So you can see that there's kind of a bunch of white people who don't earn a very significant amount, and then also a group around the median, and then a very long tail. For the other group, you can see that they kind of decline to their median, and then have a really large portion close to the tip here. You can also see that in the Asian group, they mainly have that single mode where the width is the largest, and then they also have something all the way out at the end. So this is a violin plot. And it's just a different way of showing the information in a box plot. So I'm just trying to show you the different kinds of ways that you can present geometries in ggplot. Another way that's quite popular right now to plot this kind of thing is a ridge plot. So in the ggridge package, it would be like this. So this shows us a bunch of distributions that have kind of been faceted. So each distribution is in its own space. But instead of kind of separating them fully, I'm allowing them to overlap. And so this is very, very often used to show distributions when they change over time, or distributions when we compare them between classes. So this is called a ridge plot, or a ridge line plot. And it's very popular nowadays. I had a couple of different points, but the last one I just wanted to show was one on polar plotting. So if I make a plot of the yearly temperatures like I was talking in the lecture, I get these temperatures that vary by month, and they go from January to December. And then the orange is the kind of color of the, it indicates the sort of mean temperature overall. The exact same code that I use for that, I can add a coord polar to it at the end. And what that does is change it from plotting in Cartesian space to plotting in polar space. So the temperature is how far away from that center you are, and the month is the point on the outside, the angle. So the January temperature is on the spine labeled January. The February temperature is on the spine labeled February, and so on. What this does is kind of emphasize the cyclical nature of the information. Well, Hannah, it emphasizes the cyclical nature of the information. So it shows you that as you go through the year, you're getting warmer in a very kind of immediate sense. So Polar plots are used usually to emphasize the cyclical nature of your data. It's only sort of more interesting to read because you might have not seen it before. So it's a cost of polar plotting is that many people aren't familiar with the concept of polar plotting. But it emphasizes something different than this, which is much more challenging to connect to a kind of seasonal variation. So some people just prefer this. Some people plot their seasonal data using a polar plot. So many, many, many different kinds of seasonal data is visualized using a polar plot in this way. Okay? You could get January and December to link. The problem here is that ggplot by default, when you put a group on it, doesn't actually connect those endpoints. So you could do, I think something like if you remove the group, I would have to figure that out. Yes, there is a way. You basically need to add next year's first temperature to last year's. Or there might also be, maybe it's geom path. No, I'm not sure. I'd have to figure that out. But the main kind of point is that you can take something that is arranged in this fashion and immediately convert it to a polar representation just using the coord polar. So changing the coordinate system can affect the kind of way in which we make comparisons. Now, you know this because if I make a plot like this, it's a lot harder to see a trend than if I just plot the trend line. Or wait, if I just plot the trend line. And that's because the y-axis here varies between 10 and 12, and the change is about 2 degrees Celsius since 1900. But if I show the monthly variation, that change looks really small. So you know this implicitly, that the thing that matters, the thing that varies, can be emphasized or de-emphasized by changing how the plot looks. You know this already. So moving from something like this, where I'm kind of just showing that the peak happens always in the summer, to this, which shows you that there are some years where July is the warmest month, some years where August might be the warmest month, some years where September might be the warmest month, and the structure of that might change over time. It facilitates just different kinds of comparisons. So that's all. That's all I wanted to show with this. And that it's very easy to switch between polar and Cartesian representations. You don't have to worry too much about it. You just send a coord polar to ggplot. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to show. Is there a risk of the plot being deceptive if you overemphasize something? Well, yes, of course. So it would be, you know, this. Some people would argue that's more kind of a realistic way of showing the temperature change than something like this without the context. Or there's a classic kind of issue where if I say, you know, I show this plot and then I add, say, y-lim from 5 to 30 and I shift it all up, it doesn't look that bad at all, right? So deceptive practices in plotting are definitely true and they exist. The classic ones to watch out for are the inclusion of extraneous detail. So is the plot focused on what it's trying to show you, or is it adding a lot of irrelevant things that aren't necessary for the interpretation of the point? A classic thing that people do to make plots misleading is to change where they start, or to change the like the x limits and the y limits. of course, like very obvious transformations, like if I do scale y log 2 on the temperature, that's going to look weird, and it's going to what is it? We'll just do 10 then. So that's going to magnify the kind of apparent distribution of temperatures. So there's a lot of different kinds of things that you can do that will screw up the way that a plot emphasizes or underemphasizes something. So the main point is use proportional ink. Spend the most amount of ink or color or size showing the thing you want the plot to have the takeaway message, and then use less ink on stuff that doesn't matter as much. How important is it to customize plots in the assessment? You need to make sure that the plots that you submit look nice. You always, a first, you can't get the top of a first unless you make it look nice. So there's like a continuum from a third, which fails to complete code portions in the assessment, that goes all the way up to a first, which has the right answer and does it in a way that is obvious, and then also takes the time to make their assessment look correct. So I can't necessarily give you any more than that, but I hope that that's clear. I think that it should be pretty straightforward. So as we've done today, I've given you a little bit of kind of subjective information about what, the principle of proportional ink. So spend more ink emphasizing what you care about and less ink emphasizing what you shouldn't care about. Talked a little bit about different coordinate transformations and ways of presenting, different ways of presenting the same information. So like box plot versus violin plot, density versus histogram, error bars versus ribbons versus two-dimensional histograms, and issues with overplotting. We've talked about rugs. We've talked about jittering. So I just wanted to give you kind of a tour of different geometries that you might find useful in making visualizations. And I would really encourage you, this above all areas of R, experiment. Play around with how the plot looks. Nobody does one single iteration through a plot and lets it alone. I'm sure that you do this too. I have no doubt. You spend a lot of time experimenting with stuff to make it look right. So treat R like you're kind of working with something, adjusting different variables, changing how it looks, replotting it. Explore. That'll go really well. Don't leave it in, but do it on your own time. So if you did an art project and you sketched what your final kind of painting would look like, you did an underdraw, would you leave in every single time you erased? When you erase something, you're removing that code. If you make an error in the way that you represent something, you erase that, and the final product is the additive sum of the things that I don't see that indicate that you're working through it and experimenting, and the things that I do see, which is your final result. You should be experimenting, but you should show me the results of your experiment. Great question. I absolutely love that. Finn asks, are there important differences between graphical conventions in natural and social science? I never see many of these plots in physical geography literature. Is that something you bear in mind? Yeah, there are like some types of plots that are conventional in different literatures. Obviously, a scatter plot is like a big kind of thing. Two-dimensional histograms are less common in every science, but they're becoming more common. Ridgeline plots are becoming more common. Basically, these kinds of graphical conventions change over time. And so, like, what's common in your field is useful, but you also kind of need to be aware that it is kind of a matter of taste and subjective judgment and aesthetics. So as Hannah was asking about the polar plot, is it really better to show it as a polar diagram? I don't know, In my experience, physical geographers tend to be more interested in showing things in a polar diagram than human geographers. And that's probably because it comes from this like domain of displaying cyclical data. You know, like a classic visualization that got really famous on the internet recently was the thickness of ice over time. And what that does is every month it shows a line that in a visualization gets further out when the ice is thicker and gets closer in as the ice gets thinner. So, you know, there's totally conventions in different areas, and you need to learn about how to represent that. But the different geoms that I've kind of shown you, my hope is that you can use the concepts and that vocabulary to do what you need to do with those things. So, you know, if somebody shows you like a plot that looks like this, you go, okay, so I see that's a ribbon, and I know how to make a ribbon. And then it looks in polar, so then I know how to make something in polar. I know that they're emphasizing this thing because this other stuff is transparent and this is colored, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, and thanks, Emily. I do plan on having a nice little Thanksgiving experience. There's a lot of American staff at University of Bristol, and we're all kind of stuck here this year for this. So yeah, but it'll be fun. So I'm excited. Thanksgiving is actually my favorite holiday. Easily the best. So yeah, I mean, it's also extremely beautiful in November in the desert. So it's just my favorite time of year, growing up and all that stuff. So yeah, it's just a lovely holiday, despite its kind of politics, which I fully acknowledge. Cracker asks, is polar better for describing internal or seasonal variation? All I can say is that polar visualizations are generally used to describe seasonal variation. They come with a cost, which is that many lay people are not familiar with thinking about polar diagrams. So every visualization choice you make is going to emphasize something at the cost of showing something else. Just like when we were talking about geom point, right? If I just jitter this and make it transparent, I am introducing an inaccuracy into the plot. I'm changing the position of the points. But at the same time, it better helps me see the density of points. Likewise, when I just make them transparent, that helps me to see something better, but it also de-emphasizes visually these kinds of ones that are just on their own on the outside of the plot. So polar systems, they intend to show seasonal variation. They are unfamiliar. So always think about it in terms of cost and benefit. And use ink to show what you intend to show, and try and conserve ink or remove ink from things that you don't want to show or don't want to emphasize. Okay, my voice is about shot now. So I need to take a break from talking for a bit. I will pop on breakout rooms for people who want to chat about stuff. And I'm going to stop the recording.